When you think of the richest man ever, your mind goes to the usual suspects: Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Donald Trump, almost everyone in the Forbes top 40. But none of them could ever size up to the riches of Mr. John D. Rockefeller. In this video, we'll be going over the life and story of America's most cutthroat businessman, dissecting all the events that led to Rockefeller becoming the richest man ever. Keep watching to find out where his riches lie now. His early life. John D. Rockefeller is the shining embodiment of rags to riches. Born in 1839 in upstate New York, he was the eldest son to a traveling merchant. This meant that he had to travel constantly, living life like a nomad. Because of this, John never really got to plant his feet and grow. This all changed in Cleveland, Ohio, where the family finally settled down, giving John the chance to shine his brightest at school. But keeping up with the trends of billionaires that dropped out of school, John D. Rockefeller shifted his focus from school to work so that he could help his family. He started work as a bookkeeper for a local trading company just a year after he joined school, and the working conditions were less than favorable. John D. Rockefeller was stuck working a dead-end job for minimum wage, and to top it all off, he was under the helm of some pretty horrible bosses. And so after 2 years of receiving no pay raise, he left the company with a newfound purpose: to prove his worth. After loaning some money, he built his own trading company which sold grain and meat to the community of Ohio. His grain and feed company had earned $500,000 in company revenue in its first year.
$500,000 in cash.
A sizable achievement for an 18-year-old. And then came the growth spurts. Oil. In 1859, a massive event would alter not only John Rockefeller's trajectory, but also America's. Just a few miles away from Ohio and Pennsylvania, Americans would strike oil for the first time. This momentous event marked the beginning of the Pennsylvania oil rush, and everyone immediately wanted to get in. For a bit of background, 1859 wasn't even the best year for oil. Oil wasn't as valuable as it is today, mainly because there weren't as many applications for it. Cars weren't invented yet, and so the main use for oil was for processing into kerosene, an oil byproduct that was often used in kerosene lamps. John Rockefeller saw the oil rush for the gold mine that it was, but so did a lot of other people. Everyone wanted to get in on the oil market, but John approached this gold in a different way. John knew that investing in oil drillers and trading oil was basically a Hail Mary, hoping to strike gold.
This gives me an idea. She's dead.
So instead, John Rockefeller set his feet on the oil refinery industry, an industry that was a safer and less competitive market. And so John got to work. While the oil refinery business was still fully untapped, he wanted to be ahead of the curve. Instead of focusing on just the production and processing of kerosene, he also paid attention to the byproducts. With a team of researchers and scientists behind him, he was able to identify byproducts such as paraffin wax, tar, and naphtha, all of which he sold to interested buyers looking to make a pretty penny. John was already on top of the oil processing world in Ohio, but he wanted more, and oh boy did the world give him more. John was keeping a close eye on the development of railroads in America, the system that would bridge America's trade routes together, making trading coast to coast easier. As soon as railroads opened to the public, John Rockefeller leapt into action. Within just 2 years, the Rockefeller refinery reached $1 million status as the best oil refinery in Cleveland. But this greatness also meant that all eyes were now on Rockefeller. Competition. With great power comes great competition. But that didn't deter Mr. Rockefeller. Instead of backing off and letting in room for healthy competition, Rockefeller slowly started absorbing one competitor after the other until his sole proprietorship turned into an oil empire. By 1870, he started the Standard Oil Corporation to represent all the companies he'd absorbed. Of course, there were a few stragglers that thought they could survive under the shadow of Standard Oil, but John Rockefeller could be quite convincing. After some unsuccessful bouts of negotiation with his competitors, John would make the ultimate power move. He invited each competitor over to show them the Standard Oil books, how much money they've been making. This was not only the biggest flex in history,
You got me.
but also the biggest intimidation tactic, because this was proof that John could operate on a massive loss by undercutting oil prices. Undercutting oil prices would mean pushing his competition into bankruptcy by force. The smart ones knew right then and there that fighting back was futile. John had already won, and they had no other choice to join the company. But then there were the ones that stood their ground and forced John Rockefeller's hand. Standard Oil dropped the price of processed oil by 80% until the remaining competitors, trying to cling on to every cent of profit they could, eventually dropped into bankruptcy. In one fell swoop, John Rockefeller had turned the highly competitive oil industry into a monopoly with all the biggest players in his round table. The scientists, businessmen, and entrepreneurs that once acted as competition were now working for him, while the other individuals with poor judgment were left to rot. By 1880, he had already owned most of the oil processing companies in the US. Business was good, but he wanted more. Railroad. After seizing the competition, John Rockefeller then looked at the means of distribution. His product was being sold statewide, which meant that he was dealing with railroad companies most of the time. In fact, the amount of profit he'd been giving these railroad companies was enough for him to have an influence on them, meaning he could call on them at any time and demand a meeting. During these backdoor meetings, John Rockefeller would use the upper hand and offer rebates to these railroad companies with the guarantee that Standard Oil would continue to use their railroad companies. This move effectively meant that John was doubling the money he earns while securing a monopoly on the railroad industry. Of course, this move wasn't at all legal. The government was starting to take notice of John Rockefeller's continued growth and monopolization, and the government knew that they had to step in. Unfortunately for them, John was already 2 steps ahead. John didn't get to where he was by quitting. Well, technically he did by quitting his first bookkeeping job, but you get what I mean. Instead, John thought of a way to legally distribute the rebates and profits from these railroad companies. John would start the Standard Oil Trust, a company that would make investments in all the railroads willing to accommodate his rebates. Through this company, John could disguise rebates as investments to the company, a perfectly legal move under the eyes of the law. But to anyone else, these were obviously rebates. Congress would still keep a close eye on John, waiting for any slip or any hole in John's legal logic. After years of no legal activity and continued dominance over the industry, Congress eventually decided that enough was enough. Congress eventually started the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, an act that would eventually lead to the court-ordered dissolution of Standard Oil. But by that point, it was already too late. John had claimed his billions, and there was no changing that. Cashing out. Before the court-ordered split, John Rockefeller had actually already left the company with his money in tow, relegating himself to just a majority stakeholder rather than the head of the company. This was a genius move by Rockefeller. When the court-ordered split of Standard Oil Trust was approved, the company was split into 34 companies. This meant that Rockefeller, which was previously a stakeholder in Standard Oil Trust, would have a massive stake in all 34 companies, all of which were still very much profitable, and some of which even merged down the line. Some of these companies include Chevron, BP, and ExxonMobil. This split ownership among successful companies meant that John Rockefeller made his victory lap around the business world with $400 billion to his name, almost double that of Elon Musk's valuation of $245 billion. John Rockefeller won the industry battle by keeping his eyes on the prize and never backing down from competition. Of course, there are laws set in place to prevent businesses as big as Standard Oil, but the rich always find a way.